Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Martin Smith, who is an award-winning documentary producer with over 25 years' experience in television. In 1998, he created Rain Media, an independent production company specializing in high-quality, high-profile television programs for an international audience. Martin, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
Southern California, actually. Riverside, California is where I was raised, on a farm. My father grew oranges.
And looking back, how did your parents shape your thinking about the world?
They traveled, and I wanted to go with them. I didn't always get to go, so I think that increased my curiosity. And my brother, my two sisters, all traveled quite a bit. And so I had a great curiosity. I think also, oddly, I collected stamps when I was a kid, about 7 years old, and I had great curiosity about the places that I was looking at on these, little stamps.
Did you have any special talents in the visual arts?
I remember I got one of these 3D viewers when I was a kid, and I thought it was the most incredible toy, and I took immaculate care of this thing. And, you get those little discs and you put them in. I don't know. Like my own children, I think I tend to be a visual learner. I have a good visual memory. It just comes more easily. But, I don't know.
And what about teachers? Any teachers as a young person or later that had a special impact on you?
Well, you always can name the good teachers you had on sort of one hand.
That's right.
After about 12 years of education, you get 2 or 3 good ones. Everybody gets about the same number. But, when I was growing up, it wasn't really considered a career to go into making documentary films. And people clawed their way into that profession, but it wasn't a career track. There weren't schools to go to, by and large. There were some film schools, but their documentary programs were weak. And so I don't think that any teacher really inspired me to look at that, because it just wasn't on the table. Documentary films weren't something that I ever thought of doing.
And what sort of schooling did you have?
Well, I went to, you mean in college?
Yeah, in college.
Well, I went to Brown University, and I became interested in literature there. And there was a small film society, and I remember looking at Birth of a Nation on Super 8, and it has about 40 reels changes, 10-minute reels, something like that. And I was starting to become more interested. My sister had a boyfriend who was working in the film business, and I hung out on the sets and worked on some of those films. But I didn't have any education until I'd kind of drifted off. I was a conscientious objector during the war years and did alternative service work. And when I came back to school, I went back to New York University Film School. I didn't think that I was going to be making documentaries, but I gravitated to documentaries immediately because there was an immediacy to them. You didn't wait around for people to get their makeup right or for the set to get built, and you just went out and you shot things.
Was there a sense that history was happening now that affected you as being a child of the 60s, which is, I guess, what you were?
Yeah, I was a child of the 60s, and I was, half the demonstrations and all the concerts. And, but I didn't think in those terms. I thought of making personal documentaries. My film that I made at NYU at film school was a personal documentary. And I didn't, I sort of thought I was going to go into feature films, but I was sort of dabbling with documentary. I was interested in the films of John Cassavetes, which sort of cut across the genres. Films like Faces really impressed me. And I really then bounced around the industry, working as a cameraman, working as a film editor. And finally, I get a job kind of walking in off the street at CBS News as a film editor. And slowly, over the years, I think I was there for about 7 years. I ended up being a producer on their hour-long programs, CBS Reports. Got interested in public affairs and foreign affairs, and my first documentary for them was on Guatemala in the war, 1982.
Before we get into the substance of your work, let's talk a little about the work itself. What does it take to do documentaries, skill-wise, temperament-wise, and so on?
Well, I think as I said, I came at it, I wanted to make personal documentaries. I think I was more interested in storytelling, and I'd studied literature. I was more interested in storytelling than I was in the content, than I was in the reporting. And so that's the direction I came from. And then as I've worked and layered more complex content into my work and doing foreign policy stories, I still am coming from this place where storytelling is a very important element. I mean, I've worked as a senior producer on programs where we get people coming in that are very skilled at reporting and bringing in nuggets of information, have not a clue as to how to organize it. And then we get people who are pretty good at writing and putting a story together, but they're not aggressive enough in terms of bringing in the nuggets of fine reporting. And it's combining those two that I think makes the difference.
And is a producer, help us understand what a producer does. He's really the conductor of the orchestra, shall we say.
In Hollywood, he's the guy with the cigar who raises the money for the film and bugs the director.
Well, I know,
and that's not what they are in documentary, and so it's a kind of a misnomer for documentary. They don't like to use the word director in documentary because it implies that you're telling people what to do, and how can it be therefore a documentary? What are you documenting if you're telling them what to do? So they use the word producer, and depending on the way in which the program or shop that you're working on or the particular film is set up, the producer's generally the person who is calling all the shots, directing the film, sitting through the whole edit, writing the script, especially even in the networks where the correspondents really don't have the time to write the scripts. It's the producer who does that. So they are the director of the orchestra. They work with the cameraman, they work with the sound, they work with the associates, and they work with the editor and the correspondent.
So you really need to understand, both skill-wise and in other ways, what it is each piece of this puzzle does and how they best do it together.
Yeah, it helps.
Yeah.
Not everybody does. You know, you get some people that have come up and not through the technical side. I think I've had an advantage in that I was a cameraman and a film editor before I was a producer. So I knew something about the craft of the people that I was directing. But you get people coming at it from all sorts of different directions. It's not like being a doctor or a lawyer where there is a much more prescribed path. You know, you go to school for a certain number of years and get your skills. Now
you majored in English, which says you could have gone the literary route, and you chose not to. What is distinctive? What should we make note of in telling stories through writing versus telling it through documentary?
Right. Well, you're giving too much credit to my my choice of a major when I was in college, because I just thought it would be nice to read a lot of books.
I see.
And novels seem more interesting than nonfiction.
That's right.
So I was majoring at Brown in comparative literature, Soviet and American literature, because I liked reading the books, and I was really waiting for lightning from above to strike me and tell me what.
So it wasn't a choice.
It wasn't really a choice, but it did show that I mean, in some way I was interested in stories, and the way that they were told, as opposed to just reporting per se. I never really had any ambition to be on the hard news side of the news business. And now, at this point in my career, I've worked with a lot of people that come from that. But I myself am interested in marrying good storytelling craft with good reporting.
And you started out, you said, at CBS on the commercial side, and a lot of your work has continued there. You've done documentaries with Peter Jennings, but a lot of it now has been both with public television, Frontline series, but then also with your own independent production. I'm curious about the differences between working in these two very different worlds, or are they that different, the commercial versus public broadcasting?
Well, the worlds are different. but perhaps not as different as people would imagine. I mean, I know, like anyone else, I have a certain set of skills, and that's what I do. So when I produce something for Peter Jennings or I produce something for Frontline, I apply the same, I only can do what I know how to do. There's something pretty disconcerting about watching your documentary cut up with commercials in 4 places, and I find that very difficult. I've always sought out the most rigorous editors, not film editors in this case, or tape editors. I mean people, executive editors, executive producers, who really push me to do better than I've done. And that's what I've found in public television. I mean, it's specifically Frontline. It's just a commitment to serious work that is not as evident in some of the network shops. So that's maybe the biggest difference.
Now, would you produced a very well-known documentary on bin Laden, which was ahead of its time. Is this something that could have happened on a commercial network? Now, I know that involved interviews that an ABC reporter had conducted, but the best documentary was the one you were involved in public television, I think.
Well, I don't think that the interview that he did even showed up in a long-form documentary. It was on a short piece. Perhaps it was, I'm not sure if it was
on Evening News or something.
2020 Evening News, something like that. Well, an interesting story is that when the Oklahoma City bombings happened, I happened to be a senior producer for Peter Jennings at the time. And, of course, a lot of people ran out to do the victim stories in Oklahoma City, people who had lost loved ones. But I was immediately interested in what had caused these guys to do this, and I became very interested to hear these guys had gone into the service at the same time, were in the same platoon, Terry Nichols and Tim McVeigh. And so I suggested that they do a program on what made these guys do what they did. I mean, where are they from? What is the social pathology together with the personal pathology that created these bombers? And they said, why would you want to do a story about those guys?
This is ABC now.
This is ABC executives. Yeah. I remember being on the phone in my hotel room. I was up in Buffalo, where I just spent an afternoon with Tim McVeigh's father, who was a fascinating man. And they said, well, I just don't see why anybody would be interested in knowing any. I mean, it's beyond me why somebody would say that. And I think that the same might have been true of bin Laden had I been at ABC at the time that bin Laden and his people bombed the African embassies. At that time, I was freelance. I had set up my own company. I called David Fanning, the executive producer at Frontline, and he was immediately interested, and off we went. So we did finally do the program on Terry Nichols and Tim McVeigh for ABC, but I remember them saying to me sort of in a begrudging manner, okay, go do your story, we'll see. They ended up liking it very much, but there isn't that kind of interest in reaching back and doing the harder stories, it seems to me.
Now, let's get at what the difference here. Is it that in public television, there's more, is there a greater interest in understanding what lies behind a story, or is it the different marketplaces that they operate? I mean, in the sense that commercial television is worried about what will sell in a way that maybe public television isn't?
Well, that's true. I mean, they are worried about ratings, and they do a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with good reporting and nothing to do with what students learn when they're in journalism school. And these are stories about somebody that falls in a hole and they work to get them out. Or I mean, they're human interest stories, and they're fine as far as they go. But to have those be the bread and butter and the staple of these news programs is a pretty ludicrous situation for a culture that has the resources that we do. And so there are, the tragedy of the networks is there's tons of people inside. There's many, many people inside that have very good educations and have great curiosity about the world and how it works. But the commercial pressures demand more, little girl falls in a hole or stories. Nothing against little girls and rescuing them.
Right.
But understanding some larger sociological phenomenon. And I'm not talking, there's a lot of stories that are interesting to a wide audience, and they still don't pursue them because they're more difficult, take more resources. It's a bit of a mystery.
Is there a conventional wisdom in this? That is, that commercial television needs something confirmed as being important and is less able to be part of the process that makes it important?
It's not always true. I mean, Ted Koppel takes a leading role, I think, on Nightline and bringing stuff to air that other people have looked away from. There was the case at CBS where if you found a story, a compelling story, and brought it to your executive producer, and this happened to me a number of times, and they hadn't heard about it, or you couldn't produce a New York Times front-page article dealing with it, or a New York Times fifth-page article dealing with this story, it wasn't a story. So there was that problem of insecurity that if it wasn't already being reported. I mean, much of what you get on television news has already been in the paper.
Especially the New York Times, it seems.
Well, the New York Times, yeah. I mean, that's the paper that everyone in the business reads, and a lot of people rip those articles out and take them up to the executive producers, and those become the stories.
You've done a lot of different stories, and mainly we're probably going to focus on your work on the Muslim world and events since 9/11, because you're here visiting a foreign policy course. But I would like to touch briefly on the broad range of stuff that you've done. Recently you've done stuff on .coms, you've done something on children and the drugs they're given, I believe.
Medicating kids, about Ritalin and whatnot.
Yeah, Ritalin and so on. Sort of very eclectic, but all of them seem to be driven by an interest in, well, what's going on here? What caused this? Seeing a problem that the society generally doesn't recognize as one, or if it does recognize it as a problem, doesn't want to go behind the superficial story. Talk a little about that.
Well, some stories happen because I propose them to Frontline or to ABC, and some stories happen the other way around, that they come to me. And so medicating kids happened because my own children were coming under increasing pressure to take corrective medications, and I became more curious about the whole business of medicating children. And so I proposed that to Frontline, and it is a widespread issue. You know, it's an issue that affects a lot of people, and so they were very interested in pursuing that. Like everybody else, I lost a little bit of money, or a lot of money. I didn't have a lot of money, but I lost a little bit of money in the collapse of the .coms, and I proposed that we look at the banks, the fiduciaries, the ones that were responsible for all this, and so that story got launched. I don't know. I like it to be eclectic. I mean, nothing scares me more than becoming a kind of terrorism expert, or and not to say that I haven't really enjoyed, or enjoyed is not the right word, but I have been fortunate, really, to be able to report as much as I have on Al-Qaeda, because personally, we all have curiosity about this, and I've been in a position to really pursue this with resources. But I'm afraid of becoming pigeonholed. I mean, I did a story for Peter Jennings on a season of a Little League baseball team, and I wanted to look at the American family, I mean, and relations. And in that film on Little League baseball, we got into child abuse, we got into racism, we got into sexism. You know, we opened a window on a whole complex world in this one little town and their Little League baseball team. So I really like storytelling. I like good reporting, and I don't want to be, it would frighten me to not be eclectic.
What is the process by which, take any one of these stories that you mentioned, the way it germinates and develops over time? Is the first stage a lot of research about what people are saying happened or didn't happen or whatever, or what does that first phase look like?
Well, it's a lot of research. It's a lot of reading in. Even more than that, it's calling people and going out and meeting people. I mean, you have so much time. You don't have a ton of time, so you can't read every book, but you can talk to a lot of authors, and you can talk to a lot of players, primary sources, politicians, and whatnot. So there's usually an intensive research period. Some films are different. The one that we're going to talk about tonight, In Search of Al-Qaeda, I had 2 weeks before I went out. I really filmed the research, so that was very different. But generally, for a 1-hour frontline, there's an intense, long period of research. And then there's several research trips where you go and you pre-interview sources. You sort of cull the good from the bad, the people that are going to be useful in telling the story, and you look at locations, you scout places, you figure out what's possible, and you do a lot of this kinds of work, and then you come back with a crew on a second go-around. You film it all, and then you come back for the editing. But there's a pretty intense a period of research and sometimes pretty large staff digging into stuff.
What is the particular problem, or is there a particular problem in the fact that you have a set of ideas you want to convey, but you have to do it with images? In other words, the storytelling here is visual, and they have to the images have to be gathered, then collected, and then put together in a way that does not become the tail that wags the idea, so to speak. What's that problem like?
You know, I think with a little bit of thought, you can always find a way to illustrate a story. And I've never wanted to shy away from a story if it was a good story, because I was, afraid that there weren't enough images. And for instance, .con. There are not a lot of images to illustrate some of the financial mechanisms that we were trying to explain in the IPO process, for instance. We got deep into the sort of the process by which companies were being pushed out into the public before they were ready. This kind of massive mugging process of unsuspecting investors. But we didn't, we don't have pictures of that, per se. But the story's a good one. I mean, it's this major scandalous behavior on the part of banks pushing these stocks. We went ahead and did it, and we found our way. I mean, I had a very good editor, Ben Gold, who helped me put that together, and we figured out, there's a lot of tools in your kit now, especially here in 2003. It's just so much easier than it used to be.
In terms of the mobility of the equipment, the editing?
The malleability of the editing process, that you can go down blind alleys and reverse it and come back and recut, and it's just much easier. You don't, well, you remember what it was like to write a paper on a typewriter. You had to stop and think before you started.
That's right.
Before you put down that first sentence. Well, now you just sort of start in the middle and work your way out.
Now you can cut and paste.
And I just think that, I think that's one thing that Frontline knows. They did something called the Great American Bailout about the savings and loan debacle. And it was, you find the images. You find, and there's nothing any better or any more powerful than a compelling interview. And you certainly can always find that. So I don't think about the images as much as you might think I would, since I'm, put a heavy emphasis on craft and filmmaking. In the initial stages. They will come. They'll be suggested by the material. We'll figure it out.
You mentioned interviewing. What are the key ingredients to successful interviewing, do you think?
I just think it's a matter of making the subject feel safe, that you're not there to judge them, but you're there to understand their point of view. And even if you're going to be challenging them for inconsistencies, or in some cases, I've interviewed people who were lying, and we knew it. We both knew it. But there's still ways to come at these interviews and being polite and trying to understand. And even if you're confronting somebody about a lie, to try to understand, well, why did you lie?
Without saying that, I guess.
Well, sometimes you do say that. But I think there's ways to take your time. I mean, we take a long time in doing interviews and a long time in preparing for them, and gaming them out and figuring out what's the best way to come at something.
And are you looking for something in particular, or are you perfectly happy with the unexpected? I mean, are there answers that you don't know that you want to find?
Well, I always try not, I don't really write down questions per se. I might write down some question areas, and sometimes I don't write them down until just before the interview. Mostly I'm trying to have an intelligent conversation on topic. I mean, you know, given the story, we know what the topic is, but then I just want to have an intelligent conversation that makes the interviewee not feel that I'm interrogating them, but just that I'm trying to draw out and understand their perspective. And so allowing it to range freely. And I mean, clearly sometimes you have a particular document or piece of evidence that you want to lay in somebody's lap. That's a different kind of an animal, but by and large, I'm trying to have just a conversation, and I'm happy if there are surprises.
And you get them on camera.
Sometimes those surprises become disappointments. But,
that's right.
I'm happy to have, I mean, the whole process of putting together a story is having some surprises. If there are no surprises, then what's the story?
Does it make it easier if you say you're from ABC than if you say you're from Frontline?
Oh, I think there was a time when people would say Frontline, Nightline, Dateline, what's that? Now it seems that more and more people know.
No.
And overseas it doesn't quite matter. I mean, ABC, PBS, it's all kind of...
Just that you're from a U.S. News operation, or what?
I think they figure if you had enough resource to get on a plane and get here, you must be somebody.
That's right. That's
so,
right.
you know, a president of these countries will see you just because you came all this way sometimes.
Yeah.
It takes a lot more persistence than that, but I don't know whether it makes a big difference, PBS or ABC. I think that some people who are trying to promote something would prefer to go on 60 Minutes where they know they're going to get the biggest audience. And we don't bring as large an audience to a Frontline. But we're doing a different kind of reporting.
Let's focus now on the stuff that you've done on our problems with the Islamic world, with terrorists, with some of the regimes in that area. You did a documentary on the Saudi time bomb. You did the documentary on bin Laden. You've done work on Muslims and others. You've done things on 9/11 and understanding Muslims in the United States and so on. What are the main? Is there a main set of themes that emerge from these different works on this particular subset of problems, or are they each sort of stand on their own merits? Is there? I guess what I'm getting at, is there a way that we don't understand the Islamic world that reappears in all of these?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all one body of work to start. These are not separate films. They're all continuing attempts to understand the context and background to 9/11, to what happened on 9/11. Why did 19 young men get into those airplanes and fly them into those towers into the Pentagon? What is the history out of which they've emerged? What are the societies that they've come from? I think all of those films are an attempt to understand that basic thing, as well as understand some of our attempts at investigating them and some of our cultural misunderstandings that have made it difficult for us to make progress. But it's all one body of work. You know, and I'm just probing. I mean, one of the first programs we did after 9/11 was called Looking for Answers, because we couldn't think of a better title. And we decided that's exactly what it was. I mean, we, like the rest of the Americans, were sitting depressed and distraught and disturbed by what had happened and wanted some answers. And so we went back to the countries out of which most of the terrorists had emerged, Egypt and Saudi Arabia in this case. Both bin Laden from Saudi Arabia and his top man, Ayman al-Zawahiri from Egypt, and looked at their backgrounds. Where did they come from? And nobody was doing that in as concentrated a way. There were snippets here and there on the news about these people and their backgrounds, but you know, when bin Laden attacked the African embassies, people couldn't understand it. Why would they attack these embassies in Africa and oh, these are Islamic terrorists, aren't they just mad about Israel, but why would they go? And these questions went around, they sort of rattled around in our heads, and then we lost our attention and we moved on. Well, we went back and found out that in fact, it was a revelation to many people to say that bin Laden's grievance had nothing to do with Israel per se, it had to do with the US troops in Saudi Arabia. And the attacking of the embassies in Africa was of convenience, because he could. But just answering these questions, and that there were large, angry Muslim populations in those African countries was also a revelation to people. So, you know, we were able to answer some of these questions that people lost, their attention span wandered. After 9/11, of course, intensified, and we produced a whole raft of programs.
Do you, after doing all this work, do you buy into Samuel Huntington's argument about a clash of civilizations, that there are fundamental differences in values?
Somewhat. I think there is some. I think some of that is operating, but I think it's a mass kind of emasculation of a people and young men growing up with fairly good educations in many cases in these countries, finding very poor job opportunities, and knowing that the societies from which they came once held a more prominent role in world affairs, and feeling as if they've been in some ways cut off. That leads to a feeling of impotence, and then seeing this is where Huntington is, this clash of, this globalization flood of our dominance of the cultures, of the movies and the food and everything is being, and the clothing and music, it's being pushed out into the world. And not with ill intent. It's people are trying to make money and they're selling these products and people are buying them. But I think many of these young men see this and feel that they want something that's theirs, that they can identify with. You know, it was the failure of capitalism and the failure of communism in Egypt that led to more and more young men turning to Islam, because those other isms came from outside. Islamism was theirs.
And it was an identity that could be mobilized in the face of these other frustrations that were coming from the world culture and the domestic politics, I guess.
Right, and what bin Laden was able to do in each of these countries, whether it was Egypt or Saudi Arabia, there was great distrust and anger at their own governments. And one thing that most of these governments had in common, whether the government of Mubarak or King Fahd, was that they were allies with America. And so bin Laden would say, well, you know, our common enemy, you know, whether you're in Uzbekistan or in Saudi Arabia or Egypt, it's the United States, because they're propping up these corrupt regimes that are oppressing us. And so he was able to create a pan-Islamic movement where they found common cause in driving a wedge between their governments and the United States by attacking the U.S., rather than continuing to sort of fragment their energies by attacking their own governments.
One of the first, or one, I shouldn't say the first, but one in the series was the documentary on the Saudi time bomb, and in that and it was quite a revelation for all of us. I'll speak in general terms here, who had lost sight of the nature of that relationship and may never have understood actually the dynamics of Saudi society. But one of the interesting themes in that is American policy toward Saudi Arabia, and some striking interviews with some of the principals in U.S. foreign policy, I believe Scowcroft and Baker, who said surprisingly honest things.
Yeah, they were
actually,
amazing.
For somebody who had done earlier work on foreign policy, you said you had done something on Guatemala and whatever else. Were you surprised by that? And you know, I mean, that dynamic that emerged.
And delighted.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, because it was true.
Yeah.
Not because it was sensational, but because it was true. When they spoke honestly about the schisms and the instabilities they saw in Saudi Arabian society, and understood the hypocrisy of the American democracy supporting an autocratic, dictatorships, basically. I think that that's to the credit of Lowell Bergman, who did those interviews, that he got them to speak openly. If you bring a certain amount of intelligence and you're briefed, these guys are eager to talk about these things openly and frankly. We're also at a particular time in history where maybe they were willing to be more honest because of the magnitude of 9/11. It was time to, speak honestly.
Right, because of the shock of what had happened.
The seriousness of it, and we better really speak clearly about what's going on. And these guys are also out of government: Baker, Scowcroft, Holbrook.
Your most recent film is called In Search of Al-Qaeda. You're going to be showing that tonight on the Berkeley campus, and I think it has already aired on PBS. Tell us a little about the development of that project, and then we'll talk a little about what you learned.
It's different in a fundamental way, in that I had lunch with David Fanning, the executive producer at Frontline, and we were kind of rooting about and how we were going to continue looking, what would be a useful next project to get at more understanding of Al-Qaeda and what's happening. And he suggested that that I forgo the sort of normal research process, and I simply go over to Pakistan and other places and take a look at what's happened to Al-Qaeda since the bombing of Afghanistan that happened after 9/11. And go not knowing what I would find. And to film the research process. I mean, as I said before, normally you go and you do months of research and you pre-interview and you do all this kind of sorting out of what's going to be useful. This one, we just jumped in and started filming the research process. And he also said to me, put yourself in the film and make your process part of the storytelling, the process of discovery. And so I stepped out from the other side of the camera and I became part of it. And we didn't know what we would find exactly. David said, look, I don't even know what these places look like, the tribal areas of Pakistan, the mountains along the border. I'm reading about these places, and I don't know what they look like. Can you at least just go over there and bring back a kind of sense of where they're hiding, even if you don't find, Osama, which I didn't really know what I would do if I had found Osama. I probably wouldn't be here talking to you. But, let's see it. And so it was a very simple idea.
And had you been there before?
No.
You had not?
No. In '98, I had done work in Africa, in the Comoros Islands, near Madagascar, off the coast, where one of the bombers was from. I'd been to the Sudan, and back during the Gulf War, I'd been to Saudi Arabia. But I'd never been to Pakistan. And the programs that I did after 9/11, I had operated by staying. Those were very short turnarounds, so I stayed in the edit room and I sent people out, various reporters out to some of these places, Pakistan, Afghanistan. So I hadn't been myself until this program.
I guess when you read about Pakistan, I've never been there, but in following recent developments in foreign policy, you are led to understanding that country, and one of the things that comes out is the state isn't the state in the way we think of the state here. In other words, that there are large areas that are often not under the control of the man who's the president or the army. And you seem to have found that on the spot. You kept running into that, and especially you're trying to understand the so-called tribal areas between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which it's not clear who's in charge there, and if anyone is, it might be Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, it's clear that the government is not in charge of these areas. I was standing with a general of the Pakistani Frontier Corps, and he had on his wall a huge map, and there were large splotches of red on it. And I said, what are the red zones in that map? And he said, well, all those are the areas where the Pakistani army has never been. We've never been in those areas. They've been off limits. And now, of course, as I've said,
never means never here.
Never.
Yeah. I see. Okay.
Well, the country was founded after World War II and in '47 and partition. Never been. They don't control these areas. These are in the control of Pashtuns, the tribal people, and they survive on growing heroin and selling guns and some farming, and they fight each other. But the outside forces, and that means Pakistani army, are not allowed into those places.
And in fact, parts of this you were not able to go into, and you actually had to send someone who was
Right.
who had originated from that part of the world.
Right.
Yeah.
There have been a few print reporters, and I give them credit for getting in there at one point. But by the time we got to Pakistan, that had stopped. And I mean, they weren't. There are many, many checkpoints, and even if you get past a checkpoint, and we did get past some, you're persona non grata, and it's very hard to blend in these places. I mean, they know who you are right away. So I hired a Pashtun tribesman, trained him how to use a camera. He was already pretty skilled in it, and sent him in with a list of questions and places to visit, and he worked as our proxy. So, you know, you have to figure out ways to get around the restrictions.
And in fact, he actually taped a raid in one case, I think, and it has the quality of kind of the first take on a movie that Steven Spielberg is making in the context of the Indiana Jones series, if I may say that. I mean, it has a kind of an unfinished.
We're still working with him too. He's a really special guy.
Yeah. The reporter. Yeah.
Hayatullah Khan.
Yeah.
He's a brave soul. Pashtun, doesn't speak his English, he's learning, and he went to these places and saw actual assaults made by the local police or the Pakistani army in some places where they're now trying to operate, bombing the houses of some of the Al-Qaeda suspects. Generally, they've lost a lot of these battles. They haven't been able to arrest but half of the people they've tried to. You know, one thing I've said is that, you know, the FBI and the CIA can't easily go into these places either. They've had some very, very limited access. There's just a handful of FBI listening posts where they do satellite, listen in on satellite phone calls and do what they call signal intelligence. They're not really allowed into these places. I've said if you want to look at American soldiers looking for Al-Qaeda, go to Afghanistan. If you want to find Al-Qaeda, we'll go across the border into Pakistan where the Americans aren't. Because that's, you know, no-brainer as to where bin Laden and his folks can go.
Now, this is I mean, it's a kind of a shock for the public as you make these things, because, you know, we went in there to Afghanistan, we won. You know, I mean, in quotes, but in fact, one really gets a sense of the adversary here as they escape into the woodwork.
Well, think about it. I mean, we went to Afghanistan. What is any terrorist that's based in Afghanistan going to do? On one side is the Pakistan tribal areas. A vast area, by the way, if you include Baluchistan in southern Pakistan, which is also some of it off limits to the central authority. On the other side, you've got Iran. We can't send U.S. troops into Iran, or we haven't yet. And then in the north, places like Uzbekistan, which are under nominal control. Many of the areas in the periphery are not under total control of the government. These are weak governments. You got places like Yemen, where there's again large tribal areas. Where are you going to go? You're obviously going to get out of Afghanistan and go to these places. There's many islands in Indonesia. You got Bangladesh. There's so many places in the world that it's easier to hide. And I think Americans have this notion that when we launched the war on terrorism, that we were turning over rocks and looking behind trees everywhere. But really, we went to Afghanistan and have sent small numbers of investigators to other places. And we rely on those countries to root out Al-Qaeda. Now, the problem with that is that these local governments either are not in control or don't have our same interest in mind. They're not as interested in rooting in Al-Qaeda for, you know, a host of complex reasons. The purpose of that film is to show that the war on the ground is a lot more complicated than you've been led to believe. And
this war against Al-Qaeda and our allies in that war and the nature of the adversary really come out in two interviews, which we'll touch on briefly. One is with the president of Pakistan, Musharraf, which you conduct, and in which he's less than honest about the raid on the Al-Qaeda camps during the Clinton administration. Tell us a little about that, and the sort of quizzical look that he gave you as you confronted him with really known facts about what had happened.
Yeah, and there's certainly facts that he had to know.
Yeah.
I mean, unless he was just having some kind of senior moment, which, you know, getting up there myself, I'll allow that. But I don't know. The problem is that they depend on these radical jihadi groups, the Pakistani government does, to keep pressure on India in the war in Kashmir. So they've encouraged, the intelligence services of Pakistan have encouraged jihadis to even take training in some of the Al-Qaeda camps. And so I was pointing this out to him in the interview, and I pointed out that he knew about these, and why couldn't he, you know, was this a factor in not being able to crack down? And he was skirting around this delicate issue because he is ostensibly, you know, a great ally in the war on terrorism, but he's not cracking down on these jihadi groups. And then he was trying to deny that these jihadi groups had any connection with Al-Qaeda. And then on camera what you see is I pointed out that, well, when we attacked with missiles in '98, after the African embassy bombings, an Al-Qaeda camp where bin Laden was thought to be, we ended up killing 22 members of a Pakistani jihadi group. And he said, oh, and he started to say he didn't remember it or didn't know about it. Well, it's just, it's not reasonable. You know, it wasn't that complicated of a question, but he's in a difficult position. And you know, the elections in Pakistan have created a whole problem for him because they're joining in the war on terrorism, and now they're losing the support of their people because their people are very sympathetic to Al-Qaeda.
The second interview was with an Islamic woman who was she a Yemenite? I can't.
Yes.
Yeah, she was a Yemenite, and who before our very eyes sort of manifested the possibilities of an extreme support for Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And we watched, she looked traditional and modern at the same time. She was very articulate. And in the course of your questioning, it was very clear that she is someone who is very mobilizable in some future struggle. Talk a little about that.
Well, she says, in fact, that she's raising her son to become an Osama bin Laden.
And she would be proud.
And she would be proud of that, and that she would be proud to help them financially or in any other way that she could. And that when she saw the events of 9/11, that she cried with joy. And tears were brought to her eyes that Sheikh Osama was in some ways addressing their grief and was paying back in revenge for their tears. She said that she loves him, Osama. I think what happened in that interview is that she was able to speak some English, and but we conducted most of the interview in Arabic, and then at some point I asked her to speak in English, and it's as if suddenly the movie changes to 3D and she steps out into your living room a lot closer because she's been speaking through a translator, and suddenly she begins to speak in English and saying many of these things about I love him, speaking about Osama bin Laden. And it's, I mean, it was shocking to me sitting there listening to her. What makes her modern is that she's so well educated. She's also quite a beautiful face, but yet she has the view that Osama is the answer. I was dumbfounded from the moment I met her. But she's not, you know, all of my experience in traveling around from the first times that I went to Kenya after the African embassy bombings was the depth of reverence for bin Laden. A lot of people say it's the depth of anti-Americanism, but I've actually felt that what's more surprising to me is the depth of reverence for him. And that when the Clinton sent missiles firing into Sudan, you know, he hit that pharmaceutical plant, and when he fired them into this camp in killed all those jihadis in Afghanistan, I think a lot of people stood up and said, my goodness, this guy must be somebody. If the American military is willing to expend all these missiles on him, he must really be somebody. They felt they had somebody.
And I think there are elements of his character, his presentation, his leadership that strike a resonant chord in Islamic culture, or at least parts of it.
I think actually a number of people have mentioned that he must have studied those descriptions of Prophet Muhammad's behavior and methods that he imitates consciously, the sort of calmness, and uses some of the same language. He very much positions himself as a prophet. Mm-hmm. I can't be the judge of how well he does that because I don't speak Arabic. But yeah, he has very effectively played off of those connections, those myths, or those stories about Prophet Muhammad.
And I get the sense from what you said and what your documentaries reveal that sometimes our policies do not work toward undermining his success in doing what he's doing, that they tend to have the opposite effect of what we're trying to do, namely stop him.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, I mean, when we fired missiles off at him suddenly, I mean, I was in a mosque in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, the day that those missiles were fired into those camps in Afghanistan and Sudan, and it was a dicey situation. There was a lot of anger, but clearly I could see that we'd made him an instant hero. Mm-hmm. And you know, I'm not saying we shouldn't be going after him. We have to, but we also have to be attendant to the problems that have created him, mm-hmm. and the sensitivities of the people and the predilection towards following him, and address some of those issues as well. I mean, the sort of social side of the war on terrorism has been, I think, you know, comparatively ignored. We've gone after this as a law and order affair, mm-hmm. and we appropriately, I think, in many cases, are going after finding out where the terrorist cells are and busting them up. But we're not attending to, as one person put it, the swamp from which the mosquitoes are coming. We're not draining the swamp. We're just, mm-hmm. you know, we're just stirring it up.
One final question. If students were to watch this tape and they say, hey, I would like to do what he's doing and do those kinds of stories, do you have any advice for them as they prepare for their future?
Well, if you want to do that, then you should do that. I mean, I think it's all a matter of, you know, at its root, it's having the curiosity and the interest in wanting to pursue it. It's and also knowing that the more you do it, the easier it becomes, and the more you can accomplish. And it's all very doable. I'd say if you want to bad enough, you probably will.
Well, on that positive note, we want to thank you very much for sharing your intellectual journey with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.